One of the things I love most about having a Fuji X camera is not the images, but what a fantastic excuse this thing is to actually go out and do stuff, meet people, have epic adventures. And one of the best ways of just having an epic day outdoors is going out to hunt for time lapses. Now, a camera system like the Fujifilm XT4 is capable of producing some really great results. You just need to get some basic settings right. And this is what this video is all about. I'm going to talk about all the various settings that you should keep in mind before heading out to get that time lapse, so you can maximize your chances of getting a really good result. Shooting a time lapse means that you're shooting a sequence of hundreds, if not thousands of shots, and you need those shots to be consistent. If not, there will be flickering, color changes, and other unwanted effects. And in order for you to avoid this, you want to use your camera in full manual mode in most situations. This means that you want to disable all automatic settings first. Shutter speed, aperture, and ISO are the obvious ones, but don't forget auto white balance and image stabilization too. Forgetting auto white balance may lead to some sudden shifts in color temperature, which can be as bad as forgetting to disable auto ISO. You can get away with not touching image stabilization, but just to be sure, you want to avoid all chances of having micro jitters in our final result. Let's dive in. First, we'll want to change the physical dials. Make sure that your camera is set to single shot mode, flip the focus mode selector to M for manual mode, and leave your exposure compensation dial set to 0. There's no real need to under or overexpose with the XT4 in most situations. We will set the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO once we are ready to expose for the final scene, but now first let's dive into the menu system. In the IQ menu, set your image size to be 16:9. Most phone and computer screens are 16:9 these days, but you could also get on with using 3:2, which is often used by Apple products. Both aspect ratios are very similar and both will work fine in most situations. The next setting you need to take care of is image quality. In the best case scenario, you will want to shoot RAW to give yourself the best files that your camera can produce for you in order to enable maximum potential in post-processing. Even though RAW files are quite big, SD cards have become more and more affordable, and if you're going to buy a camera system like the XT4, you should also be using memory cards that are capable of using your camera's full potential. If you really want to shoot JPEG, just to make sure that you at least shoot in the fine quality setting. In RAW recording, I recommend choosing lossless compressed, as your files will be smaller while still giving you the same quality. Next, scroll down until you see white balance. The main thing here is not to be in any of the automatic modes, so all of your shots end up having the same white balance. You can set the color temperature by yourself, or if you're not familiar with that, you can use the daylight or shade mode. You can always tweak the white balance in post, but at least the white balance will be consistent throughout your photos. In dynamic range, I like to have DR200 as a middle ground setting, because this setting is kind of hard to explain and beyond the scope of this video, but it mainly means that if you're going to shoot in DR200, your camera would underexpose by one stop, which would help you protect your highlights if the brightness were to change very suddenly. Actually, this is only merely a problem when you're using JPEGs. If you're shooting RAW, this is much less of a problem and also not super relevant to what we're doing. Now, before we set the timer, we need to disable image stabilization as well. Going to the shooting setting window, scroll down to page 2 and set IS mode to off. I am assuming that you will be using a tripod to shoot from, but if possible, just switch it off. In that case, you will certainly not have any unwanted micro jitters in your image, because the slightest movement can really be noticeable in the final time-lapse result. Another thing you want to try to do is, if your tripod will allow weighing it down, for example, it has a little hook somewhere where you can just simply hang your backpack or just make it heavier in any kind of way, it's definitely worth doing this, because the slightest movement from any breeze will be noticeable in your time-lapse. And then finally, let's talk about setting the interval timer. In shooting setting, go to interval timer shooting. There we can set the interval, or how long your camera will wait between shots, and the number of times. Literally, how many times your camera will shoot. There are a couple of things to keep in mind here. First, if you're not sure, an interval of 3 to 5 seconds will work great in most cases. And the second thing that you need to keep in mind is the frame rate you will be publishing your video in. For example, if you want to publish 24 FPS video, this means that you will need 24 frames to fill 1 second at a time. 30 FPS obviously means that you will need 30 frames or 30 photos to fill 1 second of time. My preferred way is to just set the number of times to infinity. This allows me to decide when I want to stop the recording, and this can be very useful if you don't know exactly how long you're going to be somewhere or how long you want to be somewhere. In other cases, it might be useful for you to actually aim for a very specific amount of time, but in that case you will need to do some maths. For example, 1 minute of video at 24 FPS is going to be 1440 photos. 1 minute at 30 frames per second is going to be 1800 photos. So if you have an interval of 5 seconds times 1800, that's going to be a long time. So one, you want to keep in mind how long you're going to actually need to be there physically waiting. And also you need to know that 1 minute is way too long for a time-lapse video. If you end up with a result that's about 5 to 10 seconds long, this is plenty, but of course shooting for a longer time is going to give you more material to pick the best parts from. After hitting OK, you will be offered a start waiting time, basically a countdown timer. This can be up to 24 hours later, which can be useful if you want your camera to start a time-lapse at a certain time, maybe when you're not around or simply when you want to stay in bed because it's very early or very late. Now just remember to switch off the auto off function on your camera, and if you're gonna leave your camera out there to wait and shoot for a very long time, it's also worth considering connecting it to external power, such as just plugging it in or external battery. In most cases, you will want to start shooting straight away, so any jitter from pressing the buttons can easily be removed in post, so as soon as you hit OK, your camera will start to count down and will start shooting. This will run until your number of times runs out or until you tell it to stop. Okay, let me give you some extra tips here. Like, this is all very clinical, we're just setting settings on the camera, these are all rules of thumb, and there's some other rules of thumb that you can actually use. If you're gonna be shooting maybe a cityscape or a highway, as lots of traffic moving in a very short amount of time, or just fast moving things in general, you can get away with using a much shorter interval, like 1 second. And then you want to add some motion blur, because if you don't have motion blur, it's just going to look very digital, very unnatural, and just having that little bit of blur is going to give it the more, natural and cinematic feel. So using slightly longer shutter times is really to be encouraged. You don't want your video to be too sharp. Talking about sharp, now you don't want to shoot with your aperture all the way closed or all the way open. This is not where most lenses perform the best. Most lenses perform best around somewhere in the middle of their aperture range. So if you're going to be shooting a very broad landscape in the middle of day, there's plenty of light, you want to get the best performance from your lens, I would recommend that maybe you shoot around something around like f8 and then try to get a little bit of motion blur with your shutter speeds, and then of course compensating with your ISO. Now this ISO is another one. Most people will tell you that the lower the ISO number, the less noise you will get. Unfortunately, this is not always true. So modern digital cameras like my XT4 right here have something that's called native ISO. This one even has dual native ISO, which again is a topic for another video in itself, but you want to look up what the native ISO of your camera is and then try to stay as close to that as possible, because that is going to give you the least amount of noise actually. Another thing that might help you immensely is to bring a neutral density filter, so you can actually set the settings that you want if the day is maybe too bright. And another thing that really makes a massive difference is a circular polarizing filter. So these two filters are also really good to get, but this again is taking me too far away from the basic setup of this video. If you'd like to hear more about, general tips on how to set up for landscape shots and how to set up for very cool time-lapse shots, I can really recommend this video right here. I met with the French outdoor photographer Time-Lapse, and he's a master at time-lapse photography. He shared so many of his best tips and tricks, and I can really recommend watching this video and giving this guy a follow, because he's an outdoor photography genius. Now, thanks for watching. give me a like, subscribe if you want to see more, and get your ass out there.